Since you clicked on this deep dive video, you probably already know about Patanjali, the great rishi who wrote the Yoga Sutras, which is the foundational Sanskrit text on meditation. In this text, Patanjali summarizes the various yogic teachings that were already considered ancient at the time of his life, about 2,000 years ago. In the Yoga Sutras, Patanjali identifies 7 different types of samadhi, 7 distinct states of meditative absorption. Since samadhi is sought by so many spiritual seekers, it might be really helpful to take a close look at the Yoga Sutras and to try to understand the unique qualities of each type of samadhi. Patanjali's text is extremely terse, and its subject matter is quite subtle, so it's usually studied along with a Sanskrit commentary, a bhashya, that's attributed to Vyasa. But even Vyasa's commentary is confusing in many places, so it becomes necessary to use the sub-commentaries of Vachaspati Mishra and Vijnana Bhikshu as well. I had to study all this a number of times before I could clearly understand Patanjali's teachings and used them in my personal practice of meditation. That study and practice forms the basis for this video. First, I'll explain the conceptual framework that Patanjali uses to describe all 7 types of samadhi, and then I'll explain each one of them in an experiential manner based on my own practice, so that you can use these teachings to deepen your own practice of meditation. The Yoga Sutras have 4 parts, or padas. The first one is aptly named Samadhi Pada. In the first few sutras, Patanjali gives a brief but extremely profound definition of samadhi. He begins, Atha, now, Yoga Anushasanam. These are the traditional teachings on the topic of yoga. Here, the commentators on this text are quick to point out that the word yoga in this context does not mean union, as it often does. They refer to the verbal root from which the word yoga is derived, which has several different meanings. The commentators all say yuj samadhau. The root yuj is used in the sense of samadhi. So yoga here means samadhi, but the word samadhi itself is highly nuanced. In addition to its conventional meaning, it also means collected, concentrated, well-placed. And these meanings point to the fact that your mind must be fully controlled to reach the state of samadhi. Then, Patanjali defines yoga as chitta vritti nirodha, the restraint or cessation of vrittis, which are the activities of your mind, chitta. Those vrittis include all your mental activities, like thoughts, emotions, and perceptions. So, the practice of yoga is to restrain those vrittis, to control them, and ultimately to make your mind perfectly silent, free from all mental activities. In the next sutra, Patanjali says, Tada, then, when you have reached the highest of the 7 kinds of samadhi, then, drashtuhu swarupe, in your own true nature, avasthanam, you will abide. You will abide in your own true nature as pure consciousness. Later in the text, Patanjali describes this state as kaivalya, which literally means onlyness. Kaivalya is a state of isolation in which you remain utterly free from any contact whatsoever with worldly sources of suffering. After giving this brief definition, Patanjali then expands on it. First, he defines 5 different kinds of vrittis. Then he explains how those vrittis can be restrained and eliminated through abhyasa and vairagya. Abhyasa means practice, specifically the practice of concentrating your attention and making your mind one-pointed, completely focused on an object of meditation. Vairagya means dispassion or detachment. It means to completely withdraw your attention from all worldly objects and experiences. Then, Patanjali names and defines each of the 7 kinds of samadhi. He puts them into 2 categories, which he calls Samprajnāta Samadhi and Asamprajnāta Samadhi. You might be more familiar with the terms Savikalpa and Nirvikalpa, but Patanjali himself doesn't use these terms for technical reasons that we need not discuss here. Samprajnāta Samadhi is a state of being absorbed in a particular object of meditation. The Sanskrit term for this object is Ālambana, which means something that you hang on to, a support for your practice of meditation. For example, you can use a mantra or a mental image or your own breath as an Ālambana, as the mental object on which you concentrate your attention. The counterpart to Samprajnāta Samadhi is Asamprajnāta Samadhi, which is a state of absorption that does not involve the use of an Ālambana. No mantra, no mental image, not even the sound of Om, just pure absorption without any object whatsoever. This is the highest of the 7 types of samadhi described by Patanjali. It'll be easier to understand this state if we discuss the others first. Each of the 6 kinds of Samprajnāta Samadhi is based on the particular kind of Ālambana that's used as an object of meditation. The first kind of Ālambana is physical or sthula. Mantras are considered physical because they're made of sounds. Mental images are also considered physical because they're based on physical things. To become fully absorbed in meditation on a physical Ālambana is called Savitarka Samadhi. This state is the lowest of the 7 types of samadhi that Patanjali describes. To become fully absorbed in meditation on a subtle or sukshma Ālambana is called Savicāra Samadhi. Subtle here means non-physical, and a subtle Ālambana is something that's made of the 5 subtle elements, the sukshma bhutas, which are said to be the precursors of the physical elements that make up the world in which we live. These subtle elements are part of an ancient pre-scientific worldview that's often hard to understand from our modern perspective. Here is one way to understand them. Today, we know that mass and energy are related. That's what Einstein expressed in his famous equation E equals mc squared. Based on this equivalence between mass and energy, a modern way to interpret the subtle elements might be to think of them as different kinds of energy. energy that gives rise to the existence of physical things, matter, like subatomic particles. In this way, a subtle object of meditation could be understood as the energy or creative force because of which a particular physical thing exists. Here's an example. The sounds of a mantra can be used as a physical Ālambana, as we discussed before. So, the energy or creative force because of which those sounds exist can be used as a subtle Ālambana, the type of Ālambana required for Savicāra Samadhi. I'll explain this in a more experiential way in the second part of this video. Okay, so far we've discussed how Savitarka and Savicāra Samadhi are states of meditative absorption in physical and subtle objects, respectively. So then, what is the object of meditation for Sānanda Samadhi? Well, Patanjali himself doesn't address this issue in the Yoga Sutras. So it's left to the commentators, who explain it like this. Sānanda literally means samadhi accompanied by ānanda, bliss. When your mind gains a sufficient depth of absorption while meditating on a subtle ālambana, then bliss naturally arises, producing the state of Sānanda Samadhi. Note here that bliss itself is not the ālambana for this state, but rather bliss is the result of absorption in a subtle ālambana. According to the commentators, the ālambana in this case is actually the mind itself, the buddhi, which is said to be made of subtle elements. Next, we come to Sāsmitā Samadhi. Asmita literally means I-ness. So, Sāsmitā Samadhi is a state of absorption in your own sense of I-ness. You can think about it as meditation on the meditator. I-ness is often called ahankara in Sanskrit, and it's usually associated with all the features that make you an individual person. Features like your age and gender, your role as a father, mother, son, or daughter, or as a doctor, an engineer, or a homemaker, along with all your personality traits like being loving and compassionate. But the I-ness that's used as an object of meditation to reach the state of Sāsmitā Samadhi is highly refined. It's completely stripped of all those personal features. It's just the basic sense or feeling of I-ness. Sāsmitā Samadhi is the highest of the 6 kinds of Samprajnāta Samadhi, and it's the gateway that leads to Asamprajnāta Samadhi. I'll explain all this in a more experiential manner in the next part of this video. I'll also explain the states of Nirvitarka and Nirvicāra Samadhi, which are the counterparts to Savitarka and Savicāra Samadhi. In meditation, before you can reach even the lowest state of samadhi, you first have to completely withdraw your attention from the world around you. In that state of total detachment, your field of experience is limited to the activities of your mind, restricted to your vrittis. You can think of those vrittis as being like waves in your mind, waves that come and go in your field of experience, rising and falling like waves in the ocean. According to Advaita Vedanta, experience occurs when the pure consciousness, that is your essential nature, assumes the form of an object. Let me explain. In your mind right now, pure consciousness has assumed the form of my image and the sound of my voice. So, vrittis can be considered to be like waves of consciousness, waves that collectively form your field of experience. So, whatever Ālambana you choose to meditate upon will arise in your field of experience as waves of consciousness. If you meditate on a mantra, then the sound and meaning of that mantra will arise as waves of consciousness. At first, when you just begin to meditate, those waves are likely to be unsteady. They might become stronger or weaker, faster or slower. Also, other kinds of waves might arise, like waves in a form of distracting thoughts, or physical sensations like itching and discomfort. But as your state of meditation grows deeper and deeper, those waves of distraction will gradually weaken, and eventually they'll fade away altogether. Then only waves in the form of your Ālambana will remain present in your field of experience. Gradually, those waves will grow increasingly strong and steady. And then, when your attention is fully concentrated, you will reach the state of one-pointedness, the state called Chitta Ekagrata, when your Chitta, your mind, is narrowly focused on Eka Agra, on one point. In this state, the waves in your field of experience become perfectly steady, motionless, like a wave in the ocean that's frozen in time when captured in a photograph. This is the state of absorption that Patanjali calls Savitarka Samadhi, which is the first and lowest of the 7 kinds of samadhi he describes. Notice that in this state of samadhi, your mind is not perfectly silent. In fact, your mind is quite active. It's intensely concentrated on your chosen object of meditation, your Ālambana. This state is often compared to the flow of oil that's being poured very slowly and carefully from one vessel into another. When that flow is perfectly steady, it looks completely motionless, like a ribbon of oil that's suspended in the air, even though oil is constantly flowing inside that ribbon. A modern example of this state of one-pointedness is a laser beam. Ordinary light is said to be incoherent because it randomly scatters in all directions. But the light of a laser is coherent. That is, all of its light waves are perfectly uniform. Each wave has exactly the same shape and direction. As a result, the light of a laser is highly concentrated and narrowly focused, and that makes it a good metaphor to describe samadhi. Now, what about the counterpart to Savitarka Samadhi, the state that Patanjali calls Nirvitarka Samadhi? Well, Savitarka Samadhi is said to be relational. That means it involves certain relationships or associations. In particular, the Ālambana on which you meditate is associated with a name, a form, and a meaning. It also has some kind of personal significance to you. Savitarka Samadhi is like looking at a picture of your mother. When you see her face, your mind will naturally bring up her name, her personality, and your memories of her. Nirvicarpa Samadhi, on the other hand, is like looking at the picture of someone else's mother. Only her image will arise in your mind, nothing else, because you have no relationship with her. Nirvitarka Samadhi is non-relational. That means in this state, you are no longer aware of the name, form, and meaning of your Ālambana. You remain fully aware of its presence in your field of experience, but without making any kind of mental associations. Next, we come to Savicāra Samadhi, which is the state of absorption while meditating on an Ālambana that's subtle or non-physical, unlike a mantra or mental image. Suppose, while meditating on a mantra, you gradually shift your attention away from the sound of the mantra and towards the source of that sound, towards the very vibrations that produce the sound in your mind. Those mental vibrations can be considered to be the subtle form of the mantra. When your attention is fully concentrated on those vibrations, and your mind reaches the state of one-pointedness, ekagrata, then the subtle form of the mantra will remain fixed in your field of experience without changing, like a photograph of a wave in the ocean. That state of absorption is Savicāra Samadhi, absorption in a subtle or non-physical Ālambana. The counterpart to Savicāra Samadhi is Nirvicāra Samadhi. In meditation, the transition between these two states is exactly the same as the progression from Savitarka to Nirvitarka Samadhi, which we just discussed. The only difference is in the Ālambana that is being used. Here, you meditate on a subtle object instead of a physical one. As you progress from Savicāra to Nirvicāra Samadhi, you will lose awareness of the name, form, and meaning of the subtle Ālambana, but you will remain fully aware of the Ālambana itself. Now, the transition from Nirvicāra Samadhi to Sānanda Samadhi. It's not hard to understand conceptually, but from an experiential standpoint, both of these states are really difficult to achieve for most meditators. As the state of Nirvicāra Samadhi deepens, the limitlessness and fullness of your true nature as pure consciousness becomes expressed in your field of experience as feelings of bliss. As we discussed before, this bliss is not the Ālambana on which you meditate, but rather it's the result of Sānanda Samadhi. Then, Sānanda Samadhi leads to Sāsmitā Samadhi, the highest state of absorption that uses an Ālambana. As its name suggests, the Ālambana for Sāsmitā Samadhi is Asmitā, or the feeling of I-ness. As we saw before, your sense of I-ness is generally associated with the features of your body, personality, and your roles, and much more. But by the time you reach this lofty state of absorption, your ego will have become completely refined, stripped of all these usual kinds of identification with your body and personality and so on. All that remains, then, in the field of your experience is simply the awareness of being a conscious being, and nothing else. And here, I'm afraid that we have to conclude our discussion, because we have reached the limit of what can be described with words. In all 6 kinds of Samprajnāta samadhi, some kind of Ālambana is used. The nature of those Ālambanas and the results of meditating on them is what we've been discussing so far. But now we come to Asamprajnāta samadhi, the 7th and highest state of absorption. That state does not involve an Ālambana at all, so how can we describe it in a meaningful way? Patanjali himself describes how Asamprajnāta samadhi is reached, and he explains the results of reaching it, but he does not describe how that state feels, because it can't be described with words. If words can't fully describe the taste of a juicy mango, then how can words possibly describe the feeling of Asamprajnāta samadhi? In spite of that, we have been able to discuss many important aspects of samadhi here, and I hope this discussion will help you in your ongoing practice of meditation.